So the northbound interface, if we look at our architecture, the ONF SDN architecture, and I don't have the picture because I think you've seen it many times, our three-layer architecture with the application layer at the top, the control layer in the middle, and then the infrastructure layer with the hardware in the bottom, or at least with the forwarding in the bottom. And that forwarding could be on the software side and the hardware side. So you're very familiar with that. The common control layer that's leveraged across both the application layers, the applications that are using the network, and across the hardware underneath. That's the benefit of the SDN architecture, logically centralizing the control and then being able to take advantage of the abstraction inherently that open interfaces, abstracted interfaces provide. Well, we learned very quickly after establishing the Open Networking Foundation a few years ago that focusing on the southbound interface, focusing on the control layer to the infrastructure layer, the controller to the hardware is extremely important. Clearly, operators view things from the top down in terms of the applications running on top of this infrastructure and how those applications interact with the SDN network. And that interaction is what we call the northbound. Now, when we formed a discussion group way back, Dan, I'm not sure if you recall when that charter was approved, but it was a long time ago for the northbound discussion group before the working group was actually formed. We formed a discussion group to actually address that problem. At least it's not so much address it as much as it is to investigate and analyze it. So we wanted to be able to work towards an extensible and stable API framework that would enable the portability and the abstraction levels that we were looking for. However, the diagram on the right gives you an indication of what some of the challenges are, and at least in terms of the overall architecture. The question is, and if you look at this diagram, the way to read it is that the question is, where's the northbound? And the answer are there are many layers of northbound interfaces. We quickly discovered that by looking at the various different controllers, and I think we identified over 20 open source controllers, or maybe that includes some of the vendor-specific controllers as well, but a large number of those controllers, and they did things differently. And they actually had many different northbound interfaces. So what our goal ultimately was, after investigating this problem and looking at the end user problem, is to focus on the highest level problem, the highest northbound, the application to network, not some of the internal problems that also exist, that are interesting, but are secondary in importance. The goal, of course, was to, and I've talked about this even throughout the first couple of talks, was to increase the portability. Portability means an application developer creates an application, and ideally they'd like to be able to take that application, run it over, whether it's an Open Daylight-based framework, an ONOS-based framework, REU-based framework, or whatever other framework that is being developed, including vendor-specific frameworks. That would be ideal. Now, I don't believe most operators expect that they're going to have that kind of seamless integration for something this complex. But that does not change the overall goal. And the goal that we established for this activity was to provide that portability, but also enable vendors to be able to innovate and be able to offer value on top, because at the application layer, it's closer to the end user, closer to the use cases and applications that are driving these activities. And that's what the northbound activity, at least, is all about. It's about being able to create this high-level abstracted interface, but to do it in a way that allows for the existence of multiple different frameworks and at least a couple of different platforms, even though in the end users, from their perspective, there is not a need to have many different, 20 different open source frameworks is not in anybody's interest. At least that's what we believe. So what we did is we created a discussion group, and the discussion group from the ONF is a way to gauge interest in a particular topic. We pick someone to lead the group, and then we solicit interest across our membership to see who's really interested in working on this. Well, for the northbound, a lot of different organizations and individuals were very interested in working in this. So after studying the problem for a year, we created the Northbound Interface Working Group, which is the topic of this talk, and focused on the application layer to control layer API, as I mentioned, the highest, the most northbound interface that we had in the architecture. And what we attempted to do is to investigate first and then decide whether we need to standardize. Based on the question that just came up earlier, what is the goal? The goal is not to just rush in and believe that we can standardize one single API framework to meet everybody's objectives. We never believed it from day one. Unfortunately, many who looked at this activity thought that we were just going to rush in and try to push a standard out, which is really not the case at all. And then the other aspect is that we wanted to be able to look at how applications are going to use an SDN network and then make sure that the API framework, the high-level mechanism for interacting, is going to integrate with the overall control and everything else that we've done in the ONF SDN architecture. The leadership of this activity is Dave Lenrow from HP, and he has a couple of vice chairs, including a new one. There's a vice chair that was just appointed recently, which is Chris Jans from Siena, actually my old colleague. I used to work at Siena until recently. And so Chris is going to be participating as well. Tina from Huawei, Tina Sao from Huawei is responsible for the framework. And then Pascal Menendez from Microsoft is looking at user applications and how to integrate with the unified communications environment. And then we've been looking at cloud and data center, and we're now looking at carrier integrations as well. There's a number of activities that are actually in this working group. It's a very active group. But the main one is something called intent. And we want to now talk about intent. Intent is the way to abstract that northmost API and abstract it in a way that we start to separate the hows from the whats. Or in other words, what is the interaction between the application, what is the application attempting to do versus how the application actually has to be configured in order to fulfill that communication service request at the highest level. So intent is a key part of this approach, not just for the Open Networking Foundation, but for many of the open source projects and the other activities as well. And as I indicated on the right-hand side of this slide, there was an intent-based summit held earlier this year that was hosted by HP, David Lenrow, and actually Siena as well was the co-host. There were participation across the industry, again, driven and influenced by the ONF's role as the Open SDN champion in the industry community. We had groups from Open Daylight, from Cisco Group-Based Policy, which is a mechanism that's already part of the Open Daylight platform, the ONOS community. We had other groups from individual companies who were looking at this. Some operators came. We had 70 attendees who came on in essence, an ad hoc meeting, a very informally planned meeting to talk about this topic. How do we converge on an intent-based common API framework? And as my colleague Dave Lenrow, who is definitely the one of the evangelists for the Northbound, as he makes an analogy for understanding intent, which is, I want to solve my headache. Don't tell me to take 2 aspirin and rest and drink some water. It's about solving the headache, not about what the remedies are for that headache. That's obviously the high-level view of what intent is about. It's about the what, not about the how. And the problem is that to date, applications have been forced to be able to implement the how. They have to not only talk about, I want to connect from A to Z with this quality of service or these communication services. What they have to do is to say, I want to talk on this port, I want to talk in this kind of low-level communication service, this kind of mechanism, that is very specific to the underlying infrastructure. So when that infrastructure changes or when they port that application, obviously no longer is that application unaffected by the communication requirements. And Dave and I actually wrote an article on this that was published in SDX Central, which is, if you haven't seen this site, and SDX Central is one of the leading media sites for the Open SDN and Open NFV movement, and is very open to participation across the community. They have their own editorial staff, and then they have contributed articles, and they have a very open environment, which is very consistent with the SDN movement. So there's 2 articles in there. You can see a link to learn more about intent. But let's talk about what is some of the properties of intent. You know, intent doesn't change based on the application. That's one of the key aspects of the intent-based networking approaches. It is intended by definition to be able to support a wide range of applications and be able to support a wide range of underlying infrastructure. The portability we've talked a lot about. The composability is another requirement. The ability to be able to create different kinds of services without having to make a lot of changes, just by specifying what the needs are and let the network, or at least the SDN control layer specifically, be able to address and map that into the underlying infrastructure. That's the job of the control layer and the programmable Open SDN network architecture. Intent must be scalable in every way. We have to provide mechanisms that define how the communication or what the application needs, and then let the network deal with all the scalability aspects. To let the network deal with the segmentation aspects, as we have many different network segments that are involved in an end-to-end communications request. And Shakar is going to be talking about this in his talk a little bit later this morning. And then also, we have to be able to address some of the issues, the fundamental issues of dealing with implementing a common API framework. One of them is conflicts. Conflicts, and again, I'm trying to stay at a pretty high level, but the idea that one request can't interfere with another request. They have to be separate, and they have to be managed in such a way that you can ensure that the network still operates and the application still operates, even if there's problems that are occurring in the overall network. So if we look at it, I just picked a couple of examples. There's other ones. These are some of the some of the key open source projects, since I made references earlier. Open Daylight and ONOS actually are addressing intent. ONOS actually addressed it from the beginning, and I think Bill's going to talk about that on Thursday, and then sit on a couple of panel discussions as well to bring up what the innovations that ONOS has offered. And ONOS is, of course, a major participant in this community. Open Daylight created the Network Intent Composition Project with contributors from 6 different vendors. Then they're going to be implementing in the next release, which is in June. Phil Robb is going to be talking about Open Daylight during the conference, or during the Congress. So I don't want to say much more about it then. The idea is to be able to, again, take advantage of this abstracted high-level property of the architecture and then be able to achieve the objectives of portability, of scalability, of context sensitivity, and so forth. This is a project that we have underway right now in the Open Networking Foundation to try to validate intent, which is to create some open source pieces across an ONOS and Open Daylight implementation. So in other words, an application can run over both controllers without being completely overhauled, being abstracted from the controller frameworks. And then the final word on intent is that this is just the beginning. We have recently started working on not only creating an intent-based API framework, but also bringing the industry together. Because if there's one area in the SDN network architecture that we want to have commonality, it's to ensure that we can support as many different applications as possible that have very diverse communications needs, and that we can do this without having to force those application developers to have to readjust or rewrite and in some cases, their applications just to run on a different underlying controller or SDN architecture. We want to have sufficient flexibility to be able to do so. So that's just a very brief update on intent. There's some experts here who can talk about this from the ONF. And I guess we have a few minutes, actually, we have quite a bit of time for questions. So anybody have any questions on intent or what we're intending to do with the Northbound project? Yes, thank you.
I'm Christophe Coutel from Huawei. It's not really about intent, but it's a question about the interfacing of the SDN controllers and the policy control at the core level. What's the view of the ONF on that?
Well, policy is one of those areas that somewhat overlaps the control layer and somewhat it overlaps the application layer. So we have not undertaken an effort quite yet to go and deal with the whole issue of policy, which tends to be at a much higher layer than what we've been traditionally focusing on in the Open Networking Foundation. But some of our members, of course, who are looking at integrating orchestration, service orchestration across different controller environments or controller domains are addressing that. I don't know, Shahar, if you are going to talk a little bit more about policy in your presentation, because it sort of touches on it a little bit, maybe not, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot. But I think it's a higher layer problem that has to be solved. We have to be, in essence, compatible with different approaches to specify. And again, if you think about the problem, we have a common API framework. We say we want an available service. Well, how does that map into whatever's below that or whatever's above that? We're going to have to make some decisions on how to actually implement that versus provide the generic concept or the mechanisms to be able to specify what that application actually needs, because it's going to be detailed. Yes, Bill.
Bill Snow from Open Networking Lab and NONOS. And just in the context we're talking about Northbound, I think policy is a really good topic, especially as you figure out how to resolve the intent of something, right? Part of deciding whether or not you're going to allow the intent that's been requested is to bring in information from policy and make sure that that intent conforms with the policies that you have. But there's a lot of work to be done in policy.
We agree, and the question, and again, if you think about the broader question, who's responsible for that? I'm not so sure that the Open Networking Foundation is in the best place to be able to address the policy question. But what we want to do is to be aware of what's happening, and then of course try to adjust our activities around whatever the other activities are. Similar to what's going on in things like the information modeling of the Northbound interface, which the TMF, who's traditionally been involved in information modeling, it took the ball and ran with that one, and we're trying to merge and be able to drive a more common information model across different controller frameworks and APIs. So question, Mike, in the back.
Mike Crowder from Current Analysis. Marc, can you talk a little bit about the scope of the intents that have been talked about? I mean, there's a whole universe of things that can embody. I imagine it's been scoped down a little bit.
Yes, it has been scoped down a bit because it's a huge area for sure. The way we're addressing this, Mike, and I think this is indicative of, again, one of the consequences of SDN is we have to rethink everything. That's the fundamental premise. And that sounds a little bit, a little evasive. It's not intended to. The idea is that when you're changing the way in which the network is going to fundamentally operate, we can't make assumptions, or we can't try to implement things the way we used to implement things, just and move it over to the SDN environment. And one of the things that we want to do is, in looking at intent, is that we want to not only analyze it, but we want to create a feedback loop. And this gets into our topic, I think, that that was raised a bit earlier about how it's going to affect standards. Part of the way we're going to address intent is not just try to think that we'll get all the smart people together in a room and then spec it out and then give it to all the vendors and implement it. That is not going to be the way we do anything anymore. We've actually changed that model. The model is now that we actually define what we think we want, spend a lot of time debating that with different perspectives, try to reach consensus on some reasonable set, and then we start to implement. And this is where the open source community comes in. Because if you think about open source, it's not just the output of the standards process. That was the old model for open source. The new model is that open source is a part of the standards process. We're actually going to refine requirements based on the implementation experience that we have. That's the goal of the open platform for NFV, if you look at that initiative. And OPNFV has gained a lot of momentum to implement an open reference platform for NFV, which of course SDN is a part of. So it's going to take this iterative approach where we discuss, debate, refine, implement, feed that back into the requirements process and come back with that kind of iteration. That's how we're going to get to the common API framework based on intent. It's not going to be because we decide that we're going to cut off this scope or we're going to, shape the problem this way, even though other users are going to come in with experience and say, no, that doesn't work for a particular set of applications or a particular set of underlying network and infrastructure services. So it's going to be a completely different process for actually creating something as complex, something as widespread as intent.